wonderful lecture series going on since last May. We'll continue it through the end of the sesquicentennial in 2015. We see lots of new faces in the audience, and we're grateful for that. In the foyer to the Hendrickson Theater, as you came in, there's an opportunity to, if you haven't done this before and haven't been here before, to sign a card giving us some information so we can stay in touch with you about other lectures connected with this series. And we've got lots of other great lectures coming up on the heels of tonight's. It's a privilege to welcome you to this lecture tonight. It's our fourth in this Civil War and the Forging of Character speaker series. Very pleased you're here to listen to Dr. Ted DeLaney, and I'll introduce him in a few moments. This lecture tonight and the entire series made possible by the Ann and Jack Glenn Character Education Fund here at Lovett, and my brothers Austin, Bob, Jack, and Lewis Glenn. I know Austin and Bob are here, and we thank you for making this possible. This is The Glenns are a wonderful Lovett family who've done so much in so many ways across our school. I also want to thank Director of Community Relations Sandy Rodella and our Strategic Communications Director Kim Blass, who've attended to so many of the details connected with letting the community know about this program, the reception we had beforehand, and so many other things connected with tonight's talk. We have a wonderful speakers committee, a great deal of fun to work with. That includes Chief Advancement Officer Andy Spencer, Kim Blass, Trustees Hampton Morris and Bob Glenn, Lovett parent and alum Amanda Glenn Brady, and the Atlanta History Center's Senior Military Historian Dr. Gordon Jones. We so appreciate the splendid partnership we enjoy with the Atlanta History Center. I know Atlanta History Center CEO Sheffield Hale. Sheffield, where are you? He's here tonight. And we thank you for the privilege of working with you folks. Thank you very, very much. A reminder that the next lecture in this series will take place at the History Center, thanks to Sheffield, on May 8th. That's another Wednesday, 7 o'clock, when Dr. David Blight of Yale will speak on the Emancipation Proclamation, the 150th anniversary of that momentous promulgation, its significance in history, and its continuing relevance for us today. And now I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to introduce to you Dr. Ted DeLaney. My wife Penny and I have known Dr. DeLaney for some 20 years because of our mutual connection to Asheville School up in western North Carolina, where Penny and I worked from 1992 to 2002, and Ted was actually a faculty member there from 1985 to 1988. We got to know each other, and he spoke frequently on our campus during our decade there. Ted's journey to us tonight as a teacher and scholar represents a wonderful American story in and of itself, and he's given me permission to tell it. He just said, Billy, get it right. And I'll try to do that. He's a native of Lexington, Virginia, and as he said, his trip from growing up in Lexington to the podium tonight was a long and slow one. Dr. DeLaney graduated from Lexington's in Rockbridge County's only all-black high school in 1961. Those were the days when black students took a college admission test that was administered by the United Negro College Fund. As a result, the UNCF offered Dr. DeLaney a scholarship that could only be used at Morehouse College here in Atlanta. His parents vetoed Morehouse because, in his mother's words, quote, "Ted, you'd be down there sitting and at lunch counters worrying me to death," close quote. She did not let him come to Morehouse to college. And because Ted's family had modest resources, he always thought her veto was very odd. Subsequently, he did what you would expect. He, as a high school graduate, took odd jobs in his small hometown of Lexington, where even very menial jobs were not all that available for black teenagers. At age 19, he held a janitorial job for a year at Washington and Lee, but the next year, he became a laboratory technician in the biology department. It was a learn-on-the-job experience, as Ted says, where the faculty taught him everything they needed him to do. That same year, I'm assuming that's about 1963, Washington and Lee decided to integrate its student body, although the first black undergraduate would not matriculate for another couple of years. During the late 1970s, Ted began taking courses at W&L on a part-time basis as he continued to work in the biology department as a lab assistant. He garnered about 40 W&L credits, and then the dean came to him and said, quote, "If you ever want a degree, you need to quit your job and become a full-time student for 2 years." Fortunately, he had a wife who was willing to support him and their 6-year-old son for those 2 years. He took overloads during a couple of semesters, went to summer school at Virginia Military Institute down the street. He was not alone, he said, as a non-traditional student at W&L. There were 2 other mature men, as he described them, who were enrolled at the same time. He graduated in 1985 from Washington and Lee, folks. He was 41 years old. That was W&L's last all-male class. And then he spent 3 years teaching at Asheville School, which is how we came into contact with one another, before enrolling in a Ph.D. program. He possesses a Bachelor of Arts cum laude in American History from Washington and Lee and a Ph.D. in American History from the College of William and Mary. He's taught at the State University of New York College at Geneseo and Washington and Lee University, where he is presently chair of the history department, a position he says he's happily going to give up on June 30th. He's tired of the administration. He says he wants to get back to his true love of teaching and research and scholarship. Though his training is in 19th century history, Dr. DeLaney's teaching and research are mostly focused on civil rights. He's a former member of the board of the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library in Stanton and is currently a trustee of the Virginia Foundation of the Humanities. He's now president of the St. George Tucker Society, a group of Southern Studies specialists founded by one of the great historians of slavery, Eugene Genovese, who was a very, very important mentor to Ted. Tonight, Dr. DeLaney is going to share his perspective on another great American hero, Frederick Douglass, a speaker, a reformer, and writer of such note and of such importance to our history and certainly to the Civil War. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ted DeLaney to the Lubbock School.
I want to start off by responding to that introduction. One of the things that I certainly don't advise is that anybody put off finishing college until they're 41 years old. One of the things that is something that economists certainly knew before people started retooling their lives and their careers is that you really end up putting your economic condition on hold while you do it. And so I was finishing my education with school loans at the same time that I had to start paying tuition for my son. And we actually sold our house for me to do it. And so there are a lot of disadvantages to doing it at an older age, although I had a ball. But if you have sons and daughters who think about postponing, please dissuade them from doing it. I'll also tell you a wonderful W&L story before I start, because there's so many W&L alumni who showed up for this. Washington and Lee is an incredible community, and so when something like this happens, you can always anticipate that there are going to be people that are connected with the college that show up for a lecture. My journey through Washington and Lee was interesting indeed, where there was an all-male student body, and there are these 3 guys who are married and have families who suddenly are in the student body. And there was a wonderful guy who was an athletic director at Washington Lee. His name was Bill McHenry. And one day, as I was finishing up in 1985, I was walking toward the post office in the company of Bill McHenry, and he said, "You know, you 3 guys were such incredible sports. Washington Lee has a PE requirement." And he said, "We waived the PE requirement for you guys, and you took it anyhow." Nobody ever told us that it was. And you haven't lived until you take PE with people who are 20 years younger than you are. any case, that's all in the past, but it's a pleasant memory anyway. And if there's any sense of accomplishment that I have, it's this idea that I was able to, one of those courses was called Skills in Bicycling, and we did 15-mile rides once a week, and that I was able to, at 40 years old, keep up with students who were 20. And so, because Rockbridge County, as you know, is not flat, it's fairly mountainous. Anyway, I would also like to make a disclaimer before I start. And one is that I am not a military historian. I am a social historian, and my interest in the Civil War in this regard is more of an interest in Frederick Douglass than it is an interest in the Civil War. I would also quickly add that Frederick Douglass is a very important person in my estimation, a person that I have great admiration for. And I usually sort of shy away from Civil War topics, and I'll tell you why I do that. Personally, I prefer not being entangled in the passionate disputes over the Civil War. And I've learned that the hard way. A few years ago, I was invited to be on a panel, a forum that was sponsored by the Museum of the Confederacy and the History Department of the University of Richmond. And the guy who called to ask me to take part in this was a guy that I knew from graduate school. And my first question to him when he called was, "Why are you asking me?" And he was quite honest. He said, "Because every black historian that I've asked prior to you turned me down." And he says, "The group of people that you will be speaking to are well-educated, they are fluent people." And he also quickly added that I would be on the panel with Fitz Brundage, who is an endowed professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who's an old friend of mine, and that there would be one panelist who was not a historian, but was a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The audience was packed, and I was the only black face in the room. And the panel discussion was okay. The response of the audience was just absolutely incredible. I felt like I was being beaten up. And those people from Washington and Lee who know me know that I'm not strident in my views and that I am not one who evokes controversy. And in fact, if I was one who evokes controversy, you can bet your sweet life I wouldn't have the position that I have at Washington and Lee. But nonetheless, I don't like the idea that we can't talk about topics like the Civil War dispassionately. And at once I was really bothered by this. I was so bothered by it, and one of my former students from Asheville School helped me think about it a little bit differently. I was in graduate school, and this extremely bright kid that I taught there, who was from England, came to the United States to visit briefly, and he found out that I was at William and Mary in graduate school, and he had always wanted to see the campus. And he called and said, "Can I spend a few days with you?" And we were walking around William and Mary, and there were signs up that were advertising seminars at William and Mary that were commemorating the 300th anniversary of the Glorious Revolution. And this young man said to me, "Oh, I wish I didn't have to go home so soon, because I'd love to hear people talk about the Glorious Revolution dispassionately." He said, "In England, people are ready to throw things at each other when they're talking about the Glorious Revolution." And I thought, well, 300 years, and we at the time weren't 150 years yet beyond the Civil War. So I hope that at some point, this is a topic that can be discussed dispassionately, without people losing their temper and saying vile things. But my experience before has led me to feel very, very uneasy about Civil War topics, particularly since professional historians have an understanding of the Civil War, especially those who are military historians, that a lot of people who are not historians do not share. And I think that you saw some of that if you were present for the Garrett Gallagher lecture. But just want to throw that out to you before I begin on the subject of Frederick Douglass. Now, the title of this lecture is something of a mouthful. And when I spoke to the high school students today in this auditorium and asked a show of hands for people who knew what millennialism was, not a single hand went up. And I realized that I would have to teach them what millennialism was in the course of the lecture. Certainly there are those among you who know full well what millennialism is, and hopefully during this lecture I make sense of tying together Frederick Douglass, millennialism, and the Civil War, and explaining why any of this is important. A few minutes ago, I was interviewed by a couple of Lovett students who wanted to know why I thought Frederick Douglass was important. And he is important. He's very important for a number of reasons. Frederick Douglass was the first important black intellectual and public activist of the 19th century United States. He was a runaway slave, an abolitionist, a preacher, a newspaper editor, and after the war he would hold a couple of political appointments that aren't particularly important for this lecture. Frederick Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies. The first one, which I think is the best, is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And this was a bestseller. This sort of brings Frederick Douglass into the orbit of being somebody that we know about. In a brief 2 years between 1845 and 1847, this narrative sold more than 11,000 copies. It's quite an achievement for a book in the 1840s. During the next 2 years, by the eve of the Civil War, some 30,000 copies of this narrative had sold. Now, one of the things that's important for students, and students don't usually understand this so well, is that the narrative is a mixture of autobiography and propaganda. And I would argue that the main purpose that Frederick Douglass had in mind when he writes this narrative is to build a case, a moral case against slavery. And so what the details are of his life aren't so very important to us. But any reader of this narrative should understand full well that the book is also propaganda. As I was telling these 2 students in the interview a while ago, a character named Mr. Severe, certainly that character's name suggests that Frederick Douglass is getting a point over. But I'm not going to talk about the problems with that narrative. Frederick Douglass does this very beautifully in a subsequent autobiography where he explains that some of the stuff was exaggerated. The point, however, is that this narrative, this first narrative, transformed Frederick Douglass into an important public intellectual. Now, Douglass's career began as a result of being a runaway slave. He also quickly came under the influence of William Lord Garrison, This happened initially with him reading Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. And he would not hear Garrison speak and actually meet Garrison until 2 years later. They met in 1841. And on this occasion, he heard Garrison address the Bristol Anti-Slavery Society. And Frederick Douglass was extremely impressed by William Lord Garrison. And he wrote of Garrison's exalted piety. Douglass wrote, "The Bible was his textbook, held sacred as the very word of the Eternal Father. He believed in sinless perfection, complete submission to insults and injuries, and literal obedience to the injunction, if smitten on one cheek, then offer also the other one. All sectarianism was false. The regenerated through the world being members of the one body and the head Jesus Christ. Prejudice against color was rebellion against God. Of all men beneath the sky, the slaves, because they were most neglected and despised, were nearest and dearest to God." End of quote. Douglass's Christian faith, and that of most of his abolitionist contemporaries, was deeply rooted in the revivalism of the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening begins in 1830 with the revival that's preached in Rochester, New York, with Charles Grandison Finney as this revivalist. And so this conviction of the abolitionist community, that at least the abolitionist community that we know about that begins in the 1830s, was a faith that is stirred by this revivalism. These people believed that they had a role to play in preparing for a new, glorious, and godly age. A new America, an America that would be free from sin and oppression. Garrison's mentorship helped Frederick Douglass understand that there is an essential link between morality and the imperfection of human events. Puritan views also shaped this understanding of religion and politics. The Puritan views of the early colonial period, the idea that America had a special role in the world, to be that city on a hill, that city set on a hill as an example to other nations. Only by reform and making this nation pure did these abolitionists believe that they could usher in this glorious age which would make possible the second coming of Jesus Christ. They needed to make the United States into a new Israel, and this new Israel that would welcome the Savior. Therefore, America needed to purge its national sins in order to usher in the glorious resurrection of Christ. This was Douglass's millennialist view of politics and justice in 19th century United States. Neither Frederick Douglass nor the abolitionist community had a monopoly on millennialism. Belief in millennialism was widespread during the antebellum period, and it was just as strong in the South as it was in the North. But Americans differed in their beliefs about sin and evil and the order of things, and slavery was a major point of disagreement between Southern Christians and Northern Christians. Southerners argued that the Bible sanctioned slavery and that not one single biblical text condemned it. More important, they believed that Christian slaveholders had certain responsibilities to their slaves, and as long as slavery met the biblical standards, there was no danger of God's condemnation. My former mentor, Eugene Genovese, wrote a small book called A Consuming Fire that dealt with Southern impressions about the defeat of the South in the Civil War. And one of the things he notes, and some other historians have written about the same thing, in the 1840s, some of the Southern ministers were making an attempt to get slaveholders to understand that they had to reform slavery, that they had to make it the best kind of slavery that ever existed. And Gene Genovese argues that that slavery never met biblical standards. And one of the reasons that it doesn't make biblical standards is because of the failure to honor the sanctity of slave families, the idea of selling families away from one another. So there is an effort on the part of certain Southern clergymen to reform slavery during the 1840s and into the 1850s. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, for instance, seems to understand this, because what does she write about in Uncle Tom's Cabin? It seems to me the major theme in that book is slave families being sold away from one another. So there is this effort, at least on the part of religious leaders, to bring about reform. And for his part, Frederick Douglass was determined that his best approach to reform the United States was through moral suasion. But what he did, according to historian John Stauffer, was to bombard slaveholders with information that Stauffer calls biblical politics. The intensity of the debate during the 1850s was exacerbated by political developments. And these political developments caused Frederick Douglass to have great fear of what the future was like, or what the future would be like, rather. These developments included the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the violent resistance to it, the the Dred Scott decision, and John Brown's raid. Frederick Douglass also was very aware of certain things about slavery in the South. There were some 4 million slaves living in the South in 1850, and I want to give you a picture of what this was like. This map comes from historian David Donnell's old textbook on the Civil War. And the numbers in this map represent the black percentage of each of the counties. So if you look, for instance, here in Mississippi, here's a county that's 69% black, or 69% slave. Here's another county that's 93%, another county that's 91%. Go over to Alabama, for instance, here's a county that's 70% slaves, 55%. South Carolina, here's a county that's 88%. It's an interesting map. It's an extremely interesting map that I think should probably be in every textbook if people are going to understand certain things about the sectional crisis. One of the problems here is also that in at least 2 states, blacks were the majority. 59% of South Carolina's population in 1860 was black. More than 50% of Mississippi's population was black. And so there is this entrenched slave population in the South. But not only is it entrenched, it's also very valuable. Stephen Hale, the secession commissioner from Alabama, estimated that the value of slave property in the South in 1860 was $4 billion. More recently, historian David Bryan Davis of Yale has a more conservative view and estimated that slave property was valued at $3.5 billion in the South. So it's not a great difference, but $3.5 billion. But David Donnell also argues that and he did this in 2003. In 2003 money, that $3.5 billion is the equivalent of $68.4 billion. So a lot of property, and you get to talking about the possibility of the government emancipating that property. There's also the understanding of just how entrenched this institution really is. Are people going to easily give up $3.5 billion worth of property in 1861? During the 1850s, Douglass would conclude that moral suasion was failing. And then he begins to become increasingly sympathetic to the idea of using violence to end slavery. As a result of the new fugitive slave law in 1850, there was a common laborer, and this is just an example, named James Batchelder, who abandoned his job to become a slave catcher, which he viewed would be more lucrative than the menial job that he held. As Batchelder attempted to apprehend a black man in Boston, he was shot and killed. Frederick Douglass wrote about this incident in his newspaper. Probing essay that struggled with the facts of murder and kidnapping. Douglass noted that people cringe at the sight of bloodshed and regard with horror those who take pleasure in human slaughter. Quote, "These tender feelings are most wisely designed by the Creator for the preservation of life. They are especially the affirmation of God, speaking through nature and asserting man's right to live. Contemplated in the light of warmth, it is in all cases a crime to deprive a human being of life. It is in all cases a crime, but God has not left us solely to the guidance of our feelings. He has endowed us with reason. And it is in the light of reason that this question should be decided." Douglass argued that the submission to kidnapping by slave catchers ceased to be a moral virtue, and that self-defense and the protection of one's own freedom may be necessary. The patriots, he argued, were willing to spill blood rather than subject themselves to the tyranny of a 3-penny tax on tea. Why then was it a problem for a black man to fight in self-defense of his own freedom? Now, this Fugitive Slave Act was a problem because it was very, very difficult to certify whether a northern free black was a runaway slave or whether he was really a northern free black. And so it was possible to easily kidnap people. And some of this did, in fact, happen. For Frederick Douglass, the use of violence to end slavery did require an appeal to reason. When his friend John Brown, for instance, attempted to enlist Frederick Douglass's support in the Harper's Ferry raid, Douglass counseled him that his plan was doomed to fail. Douglass did not oppose violence as a means of ending slavery, but he rejected John Brown's plan because there was no way that it could work. In spite of John Brown's foolhardy plan, Frederick Douglass hailed him as one of the greatest men who ever lived. As a former slave, Douglass was enabled to adhere to the pacifism of the Garrisonian abolitionist. Abolition for him was personal and it was emotional. And in fact, he would say that white abolitionists were abolitionists by choice, black abolitionists were abolitionists by necessity. The young Republican Party denounced John Brown as a villain, while Southerners correctly understood that the party's major principle was to oppose slavery. While many while many Northerners mourn the death of John Brown as a martyr, Abraham Lincoln distanced himself from Brown. As a result, Frederick Douglass resented Lincoln and noted that there was no way he could support him in the election of 1860. Yet the election of 1860 was important for Douglass, and it was important for other Black Americans. The Republican Party strongly, very strongly in its platform, opposed slavery. And so there's this realization that the Republican Party has also absorbed during the 1850s most of the abolitionist community as well as the free soilers. So to get this anti-slavery plank into the platform is relatively easy for them to do. In early 1961, as Douglass reflected on South Carolina's declaration clauses of secession, he hoped that the 59% of the slave population in South Carolina would deter disunion. He said, "The slaves are more equal to whites in number and cannot have failed to have learned something from the passing events. All the precautions of their tyrant masters have not hid from them the fact that they, in some sort of, have a direct interest in this controversy." And so one of the things that's incredible here is that he's saying that these slaves knew that they were a part of the controversy. And the one thing that I would add here is that this is the way Black Americans have always understood the Civil War. And I think there's a tremendous divide here between the way some people understand the Civil War and others disagree. So this is a source of incredible controversy and a source that I can tell you, as someone who grew up as a Black man and somebody who studied history at the graduate school level, it was not until I was hearing this stuff in graduate school classes that was taught from a different perspective did I feel like the views of Black people were being vindicated. So there's this problem, if you will. But nonetheless, for Frederick Douglass, it's not as big a problem as it might seem because he believed that the Civil War was a holy war. A holy war to end slavery, and that this holy war was one in which God's will would be done. Douglass feared that President Lincoln may not honor his political pledges, or he may push to honor those statements that he made that he wouldn't interfere with slavery in places that had already existed. Douglass reasoned that the effort to preserve the Union would ultimately end in emancipation because that would be what God willed. About 1 month after Fort Sumter, Secretary of War Simon Cameron agreed on the policy of declaring runaway slaves as contraband of war. On the 4th of July, 1861, Lincoln requested Congress to pass a Confiscation Act that gave congressional sanction to the contraband policy. Congress complied. Additionally, Lincoln ordered the federal government to take aggressive action to suppress the illegal Atlantic slave trade. Now, this is a problem that, strangely enough, I don't know of a single history dissertation that's been written about this. This is an area in which Frederick Douglass really precious the president. And one of the things that he says to President Lincoln is that Ever since 1808, the federal government has winked its eye at the illegal slave trade. Now, 1808 was the official closing of the Atlantic slave trade. Only in my research have I almost accidentally stumbled into 3 slave ships that arrived in the United States in 1860. And so there was an illegal slave trade that was going on, and one of the things that Lincoln immediately did after his inauguration is he took action to suppress that illegal slave trade. In December 1861, Lincoln asserted that slavery had received a mortal wound. A harpoon has struck the whale in the heart, he wrote. With the exception of General John C. Fremont, emancipation of slaves in Missouri, an action that Lincoln repudiated because he feared losing all of the border states as a result, Lincoln moved Lincoln moved steadily toward liberating slaves, and he strongly encouraged border states to do so. Frederick Douglass sincerely believed that the outcome of the war was greater than Lincoln, and that God's will would be done. Douglass believed that black men had to be a part of the fight, that black men had to be a part of earning their own freedom. Lincoln, for his part, resisted for more than 2 years the use of black soldiers. But after his 1862 announcement that he would issue an Emancipation Proclamation, Douglass was adamant about the enlistment of black troops. And I've gotten behind on my slides, which I did earlier today. And so Douglass would move to get the president to enlist black troops, and he certainly knew the dangers involved. It must be really hard to grow up in a household where your father's a zealot. And Douglass had 3 sons, aged 22, 20, and 18, the perfect age to volunteer to serve in the Union Army. And you can bet with some pressure from their father. Frederick Douglass would recruit more than 100 men to serve in the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. Douglass argued that black men had a responsibility to serve in the Union Army. Quote, "He who looks upon a conflict between right and wrong and does not help the right against the wrong despises and insults his own nature and invites the contempt of mankind. You are either for the government or against it. Manhood requires you to take sides, and you are mean or noble according to how you choose between action and inaction. If you are sound in body and mind, there is nothing in your color to excuse you from enlisting in the service of the Republic against its enemies. If color should be a criterion of rights, neither should it be a standard of duty. The whole duty of a man belongs alike to white and black." Now, Douglass understood what black men were getting into. He understood that the Confederates had announced that black prisoners of war were likely to be executed or to be sold into slavery. The other thing that Frederick Douglass certainly understood is that the Civil War was massive carnage. One of the things that I have never really understood, and once again I say I'm not a military historian, but you don't have to be a military historian to wonder about this. During the Revolutionary era, you've heard the adage, don't shoot until you can see the white of their eyes. And that's because of the inaccuracy of the weapons. The weapons were not that inaccurate at the time of the Civil War. And because a lot of those battles were modeled by people who had studied at West Point, who had read Henri Jomini's book about warfare in the Napoleonic era. The battle plans were pretty much similar to that. So there are these frontal assaults. And it's absolute suicide for the men who are in the front row. You're not going home again if you're on the front row in a frontal assault because you're going to get killed. So Frederick Douglass certainly understood all of that, and he understood all of that when he had his sons to enlist in the Massachusetts 54th. But Frederick Douglass has a faith that I can commend him for because I don't have a faith that strong. But somehow, this was God's war, and all of this was going to work out. All of this was going to work to the good of people who were oppressed in the United States. So Douglass would argue that black men needed to enlist to demonstrate that they were worthy citizens of the Republic and to learn how to use arms in the defense of their own liberties. More important, he argued, a day may come when men shall learn war no more, when justice shall be so clearly apprehended, so universally practiced, and humanity shall be so, profoundly loved and respected, that war and bloodshed shall be confined only to beasts of prey. Manifestly, that day has not yet come, and while all men should labor to hasten its coming by the cultivation of all the elements conducive to peace, it is plain for the present no race of men can depend wholly upon moral means for the maintenance of their rights. Frederick Douglass fully understood that the odds were stacked against these black soldiers. And the thing that probably reassured him, if nothing else, is that his three sons were in the siege of Fort Wagner. If you've seen the movie Glory, you've seen that horrible scene at the end, where more than 1,500 Union soldiers were killed at Fort Wagner. Frederick Douglass's son survived the assault at Fort Wagner. So, if this war was to be as holy as Frederick Douglass believed, these men, including his own sons, would simply be instruments that God was using, whether they lived or died. Historian David Blight, who I guess is next on this forum, argues that Frederick Douglass's apocalyptic interpretation of the Civil War was reinforced by his growing sense of American nationalism. Like many other Northern intellectuals of his day, Douglass believed that the United States, as I said before, was a chosen nation, a belief that was even stronger during the Civil War. This holy war, he believed, had purged the nation of the great evil of slavery and had readied it for a new and glorious age. Now, Frederick Douglass was an incredibly eloquent man, and one of my favorite books is this book that's a collection of his speeches and writings. It's not a book of his narratives. And when I read through this book, I realize that there's something extremely wrong with the fact that he ever was a slave. Frederick Douglass was probably near genius. A man who was able to write and formulate theories the way he did with no formal schooling. A man who, William McFeely, who I guess he's still on the faculty at the University of Georgia if he hasn't retired, but William McFeely's wonderful biography of Frederick Douglass makes the interesting case, based on what I told you about the first narrative and Frederick Douglass's revelations and successive ones, that the old family knew that he was a person that they could not contain, that they could not keep a slave. And one of the things that McFeely argues, and I think it's a compelling argument, that usually when slaves planned a runaway scheme like the one Frederick Douglass had planned when he was being punished, they were sold into the lower South. Instead, Thomas Old sends him back to Baltimore to live with his brother Hugh and permitted him to hire himself out to work on the docks. He made it possible for Frederick Douglass to escape. Either that or the Olds were just stupid. And I don't think they were stupid, but they knew that he was special and that they couldn't contain him. I think it's incredible, some years later, when the abolitionist community becomes extremely fearful that Frederick Douglass will be apprehended under the Fugitive Slave Act and returned to slavery. And money's raised for him to buy his freedom. The Old family accepted that money. I mean, if you are really adamant about this, there are a lot of questions that certainly we could go into. As far as the millennialism segment of this talk is concerned, none of this is new to you. Not any of you, including the very youngest people here, because one of the parts of American culture, if you will, is one of the pieces of music that we probably hold most sacred in our historical traditions. And that is the one that puts to music Julia Ward Howe's lyrical poem that we call the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Just to share a few of these ideas from this, which is how Frederick Douglass also believed. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath were stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. I've seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. This day is marching on. I have read a fiery gospel writ in burnished rows of steel. As ye deal with my contemners, so with you my grace shall deal. Let the hero born of woman crush the serpent with his heel, since God is marching on. He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Oh, God is marching on. Thank you.
What about 10 minutes or so of questions, and then Dr. DeLaney's happy to hang around for a bit, but questions for Dr. DeLaney this evening on the heels of that very, very thoughtful lecture.
And if I can't answer them, I'll just say I don't know.
I'd like to break the ice. Yes, ma'am.
Can you give some examples of his exaggeration in the narrative?
I sure can. One of the things that and he admits this in a subsequent narrative. One of the things is that Sophia Old was teaching him how to read. And of course, one of the things that has, by the time this narrative is passed, has become a law in most of the southern states is that it's illegal to teach a slave to read and write, inspired by the Nat Turner Revolt. And what he argues is that Sophia Old's husband, Hugh, caught her teaching him to read and said, "You run a nigger that way." And then he had to cajole street kids to teaching how to read and write. Now, if you're to read any of these essays in this book, this didn't come from street kids teaching you how to read and write. One of the things that the abolitionist community, for instance, was very, very, well, it seems to me to be a stupid piece of advice, but they wanted Frederick Douglass to stop being analytical in his speeches because they were afraid that nobody would believe he was a runaway slave. He was just too smart for that. So I think that one of the things that seems to me to be the most compelling argument about an inaccuracy and a deliberate inaccuracy in the narrative is that a man who can immediately almost start writing books and editing a newspaper can do so brilliantly and against all of these odds to get an education. My guess is that those lessons that Sophia Old was teaching did not cease. The other one is the scheme to run away. And it just didn't make sense for Frederick Douglass, after he's tried to escape, to be sent to Baltimore. Baltimore is the easiest place that a slave who wanted to get away could have been, especially if you're caulking ships, which is what his trade was. So that is the kind of thing. But if you want to see more of this, I would suggest you want to read William McFeely's biography of Frederick Douglass, which I think is first rate, and it's not new. It's been out probably 20 years, but he explores this, and I think he does a superb job. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
How much contact did Douglass have with Lincoln?
There were two occasions in which Douglass was in Lincoln's company. The first time he elicits the help of a senator from Kansas to go with him because he thought the senator would be a key to him getting in. The thing is that he didn't realize that at the time that he was better known than the senator from Kansas. And so when he shows up at the White House, he's surprised that there's a line of people waiting to see Lincoln. And for some reason, he ends up being pushed to the head of the line. And Lincoln's secretary invites him in, calls him Mr. Douglass, much to the amazement of all the other people who are waiting to see Lincoln. And Douglass is really overwhelmed by that initial visit. He goes in, Lincoln is lying down on a couch, very informally, and Lincoln slowly rises, and Frederick Douglass describes, he rises and towers over him. And he then writes, and then it becomes a political issue, that Abraham Lincoln received him as one gentleman receives his mother. And the opposition started using that, the Democratic Party started using that as this favors miscegenation. This is what this is all about. This is race mixing. So that meeting with Lincoln, Douglass describes very favorably. We do not have Lincoln's side of the story. The second meeting with Lincoln, Douglass is a little weary. He thinks Lincoln is moving too slowly, and he's pretty much given Lincoln advice. Lincoln, for the most part, holds things close to his breast, but he thanks Frederick Douglass for his advice, etc. So those are the only two contacts that I know of. Lincoln did invite him to the White House a third time, and I forget what the reason was. But Frederick Douglass, like so many of us who are busy, had a conflict and he didn't go. And so the next time that he was in Lincoln's presence was at the second inaugural. And he did get a chance to speak to him and compliment him on the inaugural address. But those are the only encounters that I know of between Lincoln and the president and Douglas. Others? Yes, sir.
What is that name of the book?
The name of it is pretty easy. Frederick Douglass, Selected Writings and Speeches. And the editor is a man named Eric Foner, who is also a Civil War historian of some repute who teaches at Columbia University. So, Frederick Douglass, Selected Writings and Speeches. Yes?
Did Frederick Douglass ever think about giving up religion in this country? What kept him here?
Well, Frederick Douglass was not always in the United States. During the era of John Brown's raid, abolitionists helped spirit him to England because John Brown had his address on him when he was arrested. And initially, they were going to arrest Frederick Douglass, but he was already safely out of the country. And he had a relationship with British abolitionists. Frederick Douglass also, for a while after the war, was the ambassador to Haiti. But Frederick Douglass felt a great sense of American nationalism, as did most black folks. One of the things that I teach is, well, in my African American history classes, I always have to deal with the American Colonization Society. It was actively recruiting free blacks to sign up to go to Africa. And one of the things that's interesting, and most of the states in the East had a chapter of the Colonization Society, and they advertised for free blacks to volunteer to go in New York and in Philadelphia. And what they found out is that free blacks almost overwhelmingly said, I'm an American, not an African. This is my home. And even one of these people who wrote a pro-slavery defense was pretty strong on that. Thomas Roderick Dew, who was a political economist at the College of William and Mary, when Virginia was talking about, after Nat Turner's raid, possibly outlawing slavery in Virginia, the Virginia legislatures were seriously discussing this, and Thomas Roderick Dew wrote an essay that talked about how real property in Virginia would depreciate if slavery was eliminated, how expensive it would be to compensate those owners for their slaves, how expensive it would be to ship them abroad. But at the end of this very long essay, he makes the argument, they're not Africans. They have lost their immunities to African diseases. Generations of them have been born here. This is their home, and they're not welcome in Liberia. That a lot of those people who are native of Liberia resent the presence of freed American slaves there. And strangely enough, that part of Dew's essay is correct and sounded almost humanitarian. But because he was able to use this argument to stop the anti-slavery debate in the Virginia legislatures, he was awarded with the presidency of the College of William and Mary, so he was promoted from professor to president. But there were a lot of people who understood that American slaves were not African, certainly not African anymore, except those illegally ones brought in by 1860. Just think of the dates of arrival. If you were to accept in American history classes the arrival of colonists in Virginia in 1607 and the arrival of the first Africans in Virginia in 1619, you know, there's not a lot of difference in the dates of arrival, but if you were to study Latin American history, you know that there were Africans on the voyages of discovery, there were Latinized slaves, and we also know that St. Augustine was the oldest European settlement in what becomes the United States, and there were black slaves, African slaves in St. Augustine before there were slaves in 1619 Virginia. So when you start talking about who's American and who's not, and who belongs here and who's not, then I'm not sure that it's not a bogus argument, because all of us are Americans. all of us have origins that go back to the founding of the colonies of this country, unless you are recently arrived from some other place. But the vast majority of the American people, whether they be white or black, can trace their origins to the early colonial period. Anyone else? Yes.
Maybe a question for you. In your research and your studies over time, President Douglas, have there been other individuals that captured your attention and fascinated you, specifically African Americans, who you would suggest to my students that they would look at and consider studying?
Absolutely. And one of the things, I don't get a lot of students to sign up for my African American to 1877 class because they think it's going to be all about slavery, and it's not. There's a lot of things that are happening in African American history prior to that time, and Frederick Douglass is not the only intellectual of his day. There's another one called William McCune Smith. There's a vibrant black abolitionist community, and it's James McCune Smith. I misstated. There is also the tradition of black churches, and it's an interesting book called, I think the name of it is, and I shouldn't say these things off the top of my head, Black Founder. It's about Bishop Richard Allen, who founds the African Methodist Episcopal Church during the early Republic, and he founds it in Philadelphia, where there's a very vibrant free black community. There are any number of people who are important. There's David Walker, who wrote Walker's Appeal, who I think is a very interesting person. The one black that I've probably done more research on than any is a black man who, interestingly enough, is numbered among the first graduates of the college where I work. The origins of what is now Washington Lee dates to 1749. And there was a free black who started his studies at Princeton in 1790 named John Chavis. And he was studying under the tutelage of the president of course, then it was the College of New Jersey, a man named John Witherspoon. Witherspoon dies in 1795, and John Chavis subsequently appears on the rolls at Liberty Hall Academy, that while he's there becomes Washington Academy. This is a forerunner of the school. And this man was training for the ministry, because one of the things the evangelical churches did is they used black exhorters to convert slaves. And so, John Chavis was Presbyterian, and Presbyterian church required a college-educated clergy. And so he did his training at Washington Academy, and the Presbyterian Research Center had 3 folders on John Chavis that were from the minutes of the Lexington Presbytery that documented his examination for being licensed as a Presbyterian minister. And one is that he had to give certain theological exegesis in Latin and Greek. And that also amazes me, because when we like to brag about how well educated we are, how many of us could do anything in Latin and Greek? And I have a sister who's a classics major in college, and she was very bright. She's certainly smarter than me, and I doubt she could put together an essay in either Latin or Greek today after all these years. So, a very brilliant man that Washington Lee University is very proud of, and there is a marker that commemorates him. But I've done more on him than anything, and one of these days I need to formally write about him. There's a dreadful biography about him that was written by a woman who claims to be a descendant. And one of the problems when you write about people that you want to claim kinship with is that you try to turn them into what you want them to be. And there's a lot of taking liberties with things that are just not true about him, because this is the way things were in her family. And so I have real problems with the biography that she's written. But anyway, there are lots of people out there to work on and to research.
About one more question, folks.
Yes.
What do you think, in your opinion, separates Frederick Douglass from all the rest of his skills and characters?
I have hearing aids, but they didn't work very well. I'm hearing you, so.
My question is, what, in your opinion, is a skill or characteristic that separates Frederick Douglass from the many leaders that we have in our country?
That's a good question, and I'm not really sure how to start on that one. I think that one of the things that separates him is that he had the conviction of his faith, and the conviction of his faith in a way that a lot of us don't, and have never desired to have that kind of faith. I don't know that there's anything that I would so strongly believe in that I would be willing to pressure my son to risk his life for. And that is because the one thing that I love far better than myself, far better than life, anything that I know of in life, is my son. And when I think about what Frederick Douglass does, where the ultimate sacrifice, it seems to me, is to pressure your sons into going to fight in one of the bloodiest wars that had happened in the history of probably mankind up to that point, and to have an understanding that in the end, God is going to take care of everything. And if those sons died because God was using them as his instruments. I don't have that kind of faith. And if you do, I compliment you on it. But it seems to me that that kind of thing sets him apart. The other thing is persistence. There's something that you strongly believe in, be persistent. It's a real virtue.
Thank you, Ted. So very, very much. Please join us for our next lecture day in the History Center. Light, 7 o'clock. Thanks for being with us tonight.